Well, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here with you today for the Brendan F. Brown Lecture Series. This series was named in honor of the 6th Dean of the Law School, Brendan Francis Brown, who was Dean from 1949 until 1954. The lecture series seeks to provide an opportunity for outstanding professionals from a variety of fields who have made significant contributions to public life to share their perspectives with the law school community. We are deeply honored to have for today's speaker, Mark Hetfield, President and CEO of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who is an expert in refugee and immigration law and policy. I would like to thank Professor Stacy Bruston, the Director of the Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Clinic of the Columbus Community Legal Services, for identifying our speaker and for bringing such an accomplished expert to speak with us. Please help me welcome Professor Bruston, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm honored today to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Mark Hetfield, President and CEO of HIAS. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, is one of the oldest refugee organizations in the United States. Founded in 1881 to help Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia, HIAS has led the fight against persecution of refugees around the world, including immigrants and refugees who have sought sanctuary in the United States. Mr. Hetfield has had a long and distinguished career in refugee and immigration law and policy, and the details are outlined in your program, so I'm just going to highlight a few of his many accomplishments. Mr. Hetfield received his law degree at Georgetown University Law School and practiced immigration law in private practice and adjudicated appeals before the Immigration and Naturalization Service. He began his career at HIAS, which has been a 25-year career, maybe a little bit longer at HIAS. 30, okay, we're at 30. As a caseworker in Rome, assisting Jewish refugee applicants from the Soviet Union. He then rejoined HIAS as its Washington, D.C. representative and director of international operations. Between his roles at HIAS, Mr. Hetfield served as senior advisor on refugee issues at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he directed a study on the treatment of asylum seekers, an issue that is extremely important to us today. Most recently, he served as the agency's senior vice president of policy and programs, and then was appointed as president and CEO. Mr. Hetfield has led HIAS's transformation from an organization focused on Jewish immigrants to a global agency assisting refugees of all faiths and ethnicities. And as a result, HIAS is currently one of the 9 major resettlement organizations that it's an implementing partner of the United Nations Refugee Agency and U.S. Department of State, and they play a major role in resettling refugees who come to the U.S. as well as worldwide. So these days, we're reading jarring headlines every day about immigrants and refugees and the rise of white nationalism and anti-refugee sentiment in the U.S. and around the world. At times, it can be difficult to sort truth from fiction. Do we have a refugee crisis in the U.S.? What exactly does that crisis look like? What are the causes of forced migration to the U.S. and around the world? And what are reasonable policies to adopt to protect the dignity and rights of those fleeing humanitarian crisis and persecution? What is our individual and collective responsibility as Jews, as Catholics, as a country, to welcome and protect the stranger among us? These are questions that Mark Hetfield, a leader who's been on the ground as well as at the table at the highest levels of policy discussion, is best suited to answer. He is passionate about HIAS's mission to help all those who flee ethnic cleansing, violence, and other forms of persecution. He has said that HIAS doesn't help people because they are Jewish, but because we are Jewish. The same can be said of the many Catholic-affiliated organizations, such as Catholic Charities, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, and Catholic Relief Services, that work tirelessly to preserve the dignity and human rights of immigrant and refugees from all faith traditions and origins. And it is my hope that this lecture today will open new opportunities for those of us at Catholic University to join with organizations such as HIAS to develop compassionate and welcoming responses to immigrants and refugees seeking protection. So it's my great pleasure to welcome today Mr. Mark Hetfield.
Thank you. How many people have heard of HIAS before today? And how many people had heard of HIAS before October 27th? Okay, a few less. It is a great honor to be here today giving a lecture in memory of Dean Brendan F. Brown. And he's somebody who truly, I did my homework, recognized the dignity of all people and the role and responsibility of lawyers in the pursuit of justice. And he also recognized the role of law and the role of lawyers in rebuilding the post-war world. And that is a world where the entire refugee protection regime was built. And that is a regime right now that is under threat. I'm here to tell you that the responsibility to welcome refugees falls upon each one of us, and that lawyers have a special responsibility here. It takes lawyers to protect the human rights of refugees and never have refugees needed protection as badly as they need it now. There is no group that is more vulnerable in society than the stranger, than the migrant, or especially the refugee. And at HIAS we say there's a reason that God commanded us no less than 36 times in the Torah, in the Old Testament, to welcome the stranger, to love the stranger as ourselves, because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, a migrant is anyone who leaves one place for another, but a refugee is someone who flees, who crosses an international border, fleeing due to persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Now, HIAS actually no longer spells out its name because it really doesn't adequately describe or accurately describe who we are. But HIAS did stand, as was said in my introduction by Professor Bruston, for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Other than for the millions of people, though, that HIAS has helped over the last century, HIAS was a relatively obscure organization until October 27th of last year, when a white supremacist terrorist murdered 11 people who were praying in the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, and he alleged, just before going in to commit that heinous act, that HIAS was bringing in invaders to kill his people. One of the congregations that was housed in that synagogue, in the Tree of Life synagogue, was Dor Hadash. And Dor Hadash had just finished the week before celebrating a special refugee service, working with HIAS to do so, which we called Refugee Shabbat. Having lived through that nightmare, words cannot describe the horror that we felt after the massacre of 50 Muslims last week in Christchurch, New Zealand. And in fact, many of New Zealand's Muslim community were resettled refugees, which is exactly what the congregation in Dor Hadash was celebrating just before the massacre. Let me describe HIAS to you. HIAS is one of the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, 6 of them faith-based, that work in partnership with the U.S. State Department and the UN Refugee Agency to identify refugees overseas who need resettlement, who can't really remain safely where they are, and who are then resettled to the United States. What we do and the other 8 agencies do is we greet them at the airport, find them housing, get them in that housing, furnish it, stock it with food, get their kids in school, teach them basic English, and try to get them employed as quickly as possible. We also help refugees who made it here on their own to get asylum, and HIAS works in over a dozen countries to protect refugees where they are. Now, the H in HIAS is no longer spelled out because the H is for Hebrew, which was a word that was used to describe the Jewish people in the 19th century. It's now, however, really just a language. So it adds to the confusion when we spell out the name HIAS. And the H also used to refer to the people whom we helped, Hebrews or Jews. But today the letter no longer stands for whom we help, but why we help. We now help people because we are Jewish. We're no longer helping people because they are Jewish. And the I isn't spelled out anymore either in HIAS. The I stood for immigrant. But that does not accurately reflect who our clients are now or even who they were then. When we were founded in the 19th century, legally in the US, there was no such thing as a refugee. Everybody was an immigrant. Even though the people that we were helping at that time, most of them were actually refugees. They were people who were fleeing persecution. But there was no distinction between refugees and immigrants under US law. The immigration inspectors on Ellis Island didn't care if a person was fleeing persecution or not. It just wasn't relevant to the decision to let them in. Only in 1980, 100 years after HIAS was founded, did Congress pass the Refugee Act, which finally codified the word refugee in statute and created a system for protecting refugees. So we no longer call ourselves the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. We're just HIAS, which is a Jewish organization that aids forcibly displaced persons regardless of their religion or their ethnicity. Now, over 2,000 years ago, around the time of Christ, there was a rabbi, a famous Jewish sage known as Hillel. And he was once challenged by a non-Jew who asked him to recite the entire Torah standing on one foot. The non-Jew promised that he would convert if Hillel was able to do that. Hillel did so. What he did was he simply said, "What is hateful to you, do not do unto any other person." That is the entire Torah. All the rest is just commentary. Were Hillel's lesson universally applied today, there would be no refugees, as refugees are people who escape hatred on account of who they are or what they believe. But instead, we now have over 68 million refugees and internally displaced persons, which is more than the Second World War. In fact, it's more than at any time in human history. There's a global responsibility to welcome refugees, and that's why we believe that this responsibility is yours, it's mine, it's ours. It's a responsibility that we have because the homelands, the states of these refugees are no longer protecting them or refuse to protect them, or in fact are the ones that are persecuting them, which is why they fled. As I mentioned earlier, in the Torah, God had to explain 36 times to the Hebrews why they had to welcome the stranger. Because you are once strangers too, and because I am the Lord your God. Likewise, the international community had to draft a refugee convention in 1951 to prevent repetition of one of the greatest tragedies in world history, when persecuted peoples, Jews, LGBTI people, Roma, and others, were trapped inside of a genocide with no way to escape, behind paper walls constructed of visa requirements that were designed to deny them protection. The Refugee Convention of 1951, however, articulates this global responsibility to welcome. What does the Refugee Convention say? Standing on one foot, I would say that a refugee is a person who flees one country due to a well-founded fear of persecution on account of who they are or what they believe. A refugee cannot be returned to his or her persecutor. Anyone claiming to be a refugee shall be regarded as a refugee until found to be otherwise. And refugees are entitled to the same human rights as you and me. That is the entire Refugee Convention. All the rest is commentary. But why is welcoming refugees a global responsibility? It's because every state has the obligation to protect the human rights of all people within it. But in the case of a refugee, the state, the country of the refugee, the country where the refugee came from, was either unable or unwilling to protect the person, or was even a willing participant in the persecution of that person. In such cases, a person needs to cross an international border in order to protect his or her life or liberty. That's what makes the person a refugee. Every state now has a responsibility, which didn't exist during the Second World War, to protect each and every refugee who seeks protection. And while the obligation to protect a refugee at a country's frontier is absolute, and while refugees are more contributor than cost to economies, the economy and social capacity of host countries to welcome and integrate refugees does have its limits, just as a practical matter, not as a legal matter. At some point, host countries need assistance from other countries, but they're not entitled to it under the Refugee Convention. Syria's neighbors are well beyond that point. Lebanon, for example, in 2011, when the conflict began in Syria, only hosted about 10,000 refugees and asylum seekers. Today, they host upwards of 1.2 million in a country of only 5 million people. They need help, as does Turkey, which hosts over 3 million Syrian refugees, and Jordan, another very small country that hosts around 700,000. The international community needs to offer much more assistance to assist both refugees and their host communities than it is now doing, and needs to offer many more opportunities for refugees from host countries to go to safe third countries, particularly when they're being hosted by countries that have reached their saturation points. Has the United States been helping? Well, in 2016, the US did share responsibility by resettling around 16,000 Syrian refugees. We thought that number then was pathetically small, given the need and given the immense capacity of the United States. But last year, the United States resettled 67 Syrian refugees. Not 67,000, not 6,700, but 67. If countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey are to live up to their responsibility toward refugees, which falls only on them as an accident of geography, you and I and our country need to live up to ours. You will probably remember, in fact, I'm certain you remember, in September of 2015, the photograph of the dead body of Ilan Kurdi, three-year-old Syrian boy, washed up on a Turkish beach. He humanized the reality that refugees themselves have determined that host countries are beyond their saturation points. Refugees like Ilan's family are risking and losing their lives in order to flee for a second or a third time. We were all haunted by that image, but were we actually haunted enough to fulfill our responsibility and to address the push factors that are causing repeated displacement? Not so far. And with so many refugees facing years of displacement, for Syrian refugees, they've been displaced for 8 years now. Darfur refugees have been displaced for over 14 years. Somali refugees, many of them have been displaced for over 25 years. Yet we continue to treat refugee crises with humanitarian assistance like emergencies, rather than with development efforts to benefit both refugees and their host communities. Then there is the particularly vexing issue of security. Some countries claim they cannot resettle significant numbers of Syrian refugees or Somalis or other groups due to security concerns. Security concerns about refugees have existed for centuries. This is absolutely nothing new. Every country has the need and has the right to screen refugees to identify those who pose a threat to security. But what really is a security concern? What is the impact on the refugees who are turned away as a security concern? What's the impact of the host countries who end up hosting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of refugees who are deemed by others to be security concerns? Should screening states or the international community somehow compensate host countries and the refugees themselves when this happens? At what point do security screenings become so broad and so time-consuming that they not only eclipse our duty to welcome, but threaten more lives than they can possibly save. I thought these lessons, these fears, were learned during World War II when the world confused people fleeing terror with those who were causing the terror they were fleeing. As a result, as I said, millions of Jews, Roma, LGBTI persons were literally trapped inside of their own genocide. But today, those lessons are fading fast. To what extent, I have to ask myself every day, are these security screenings keeping us safe? And to what extent are they just a smokescreen that excludes innocent refugees just because they look different than we do or worship differently than we do? And this is why, as I said, the U.S. admitted only 67 refugees from Syria last year out of 12 million displaced. The duty to welcome refugees is a personal responsibility, it's a national responsibility, and it's an international responsibility. And if we don't fulfill all three of these responsibilities, we have not learned anything from history. The role of lawyers in this historic battle is more important than ever, and we need more of you to engage in this battle. For me, I would say, up until last year, the scariest, worst day in my career was November 13th, 2015, or at least the week after that. That's when there were terrorist attacks in Paris in which 130 people were killed. That was horrific in and by itself. But there were casualties suffered here in the United States as well. Casualties like the American ideal of tolerance, and the progress that we thought we had made toward the ideal of judging people by the content of their character, rather than the color of their skin, or their religion, or their nationality, or their ethnicity. In the wake of that attack in Paris, within days, the House of Representatives passed the misnamed SAFE Act, which, if it had been passed by the Senate and signed into law, which thank God it wasn't, would have ratcheted up an already complex and cumbersome security vetting process to such an extent that Iraqis and Syrian refugees would have found it virtually impossible to enter the United States. And what was worse was within a week after that attack, 31 governors declared that they were banning, or at least temporarily banning, Syrian Muslim refugees from their states. And all 14 Republican presidential candidates at that time, including a few with stellar records of being pro-immigration and pro-refugee, took positions that basically echoed those of the 31 governors. And the first question I asked myself when these governors came out one by one in rapid succession was if they had bothered talking to their lawyers. I mean, it was so clear to me and to anyone that they didn't have the authority to do what they were doing. Governors don't have the authority to ban refugees from being resettled in their states. That is entirely a federal responsibility. But they certainly don't have the authority to ban people from their states based on their national origin, based on where they were born, based on their religion. And yet that's what 31 governors tried to do. Fortunately, only a handful actually followed up their words with actions, but these were not insignificant. The governor of Texas, the governor of New Jersey, the governor of Kansas, the governor of Maine, all knew they couldn't actually ban Syrian Muslim refugees from their states, but what they did was they withdrew from the refugee program. They said, we are no longer participating in the federal program to resettle refugees. Of course, they couldn't really do that either. All they could do is refuse to accept federal money for the refugees that the federal government was going to put in their states anyway. So that money went to organizations like, not HIAS, but like HIAS, the IRC, U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and Catholic Charities, Church World Service. Other refugee organizations ended up getting that funding that should have gone to states to do a job that should have been done by the states. Now, Of the 14 presidential candidates that I'd mentioned who joined the governors in calling for a ban on certain refugees, indeed one of them was elected president, and he wasted no time in attempting to implement a temporary ban on refugees, which to our horror at HIAS was signed on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. He implemented a temporary ban on refugees, or tried to, as well as other groups from entering the United States. But you'll remember the reaction was absolutely incredible, with thousands of protesters occupying airports all over the country, just within hours, if not minutes, after the bans were announced. And the ones who made the biggest difference among all those occupiers of the airports, all those protesters, were those who were lawyers. We were really scared at HIAS when the president took office because of his campaign promise for basically what would be a refugee ban. Because we know that as a matter of law, the president has a lot of discretion in resettling refugees to the United States. He doesn't have that discretion in terms of allowing people to apply for asylum. That's a legal obligation, though he's trying to get around that right now. But he does have a lot of discretion in terms of inviting people to be resettled here. And this president has succeeded in making this country less welcoming to refugees, with the number falling from 85,000 resettled in 2016 to only 22,491 last year, the lowest number of refugees allowed into this country since President Carter signed the Refugee Act in 1980. But thanks to lawyers, for the first time in history, agencies like HIAS, states like the state of Minnesota, the state of Washington, the state of Hawaii, and family members of refugees were all found to have standing to bring suit against the president for the first time on issues relating to refugee resettlement. That was a big victory, and that did have an impact. We need more help, though, from lawyers, because it does take lawyers in this country and in all the countries where HIAS operates to ensure that the rights of refugees are protected and that they are not returned to countries where they would be harmed. And it's interesting to note that there are two, for those of you who are not familiar with it, interconnected systems of asylum processes in this country. Both of these systems are suffering from years-long backlogs. The first of these is the affirmative asylum process, and that's where people actually step forward and voluntarily ask for asylum. That is a non-adversarial process, so they are interviewed in a non-adversarial setting and at an administrative level. That backlog is pending at about 320,000 cases right now. Now, the second process is in the immigration courts, whereas if you're in removal proceedings, if you're in deportation proceedings, you can raise asylum as a defense, because if you're a refugee, if you're entitled to asylum, you cannot be deported. That backlog is 700,000 cases right now. So you add those two together, that's a backlog of 1 million cases that are clogging up the system. And this means two things. It means people are not getting the protection that they need, but it also means that they're not getting deported. So this is a lose-lose for everybody. We need more lawyers in the system. We need more lawyers working for the government. We need more lawyers as immigration judges. And we need more lawyers, most of all, helping asylum seekers navigate this system. And what really drives me nuts is the president, as you know, held much of the government, including immigration judges, hostage this year, demanding a ransom of $5 billion to spend on a border wall. But frankly, a much more effective approach to manage migration would have been to take that money and spend it on immigration judges and on immigration infrastructure, on immigration decision makers to address that backlog. The budget of the entire immigration court system is 1/10 of that figure. But of course, that was not only was that not on the table, but during that entire period of time, or most of the period of time, immigration judges were not able to hear cases, and therefore the system it slowed down even further. And it cannot be overemphasized that asylum seekers who have legal representation help them navigate this Byzantine maze of immigration bureaucracy, are 5 times more likely to get asylum than those without representation. 10% of unrepresented asylum seekers get asylum, but nearly half of represented asylum seekers do. Many asylum seekers are detained in remote prison-like detention facilities with no internet access and very difficult access to attorneys. Their immigration court proceedings are often held on closed-circuit television with the judge and the trial attorney from the Homeland Security Department in the courtroom hundreds of miles away. If the asylum seeker is lucky enough to get his or her own attorney, that attorney has to make a decision. Do I sit in the detention cell, in the detention center with my client, or do I sit with the judge and the trial attorney hundreds of miles away in the immigration courtroom? When I was doing the asylum study that was referenced in my introduction, I talked to an ICE attorney, and I'll never forget, I asked the ICE attorney, Immigration and Customs Enforcement trial attorney, about this process, and he said, you know, I think this process of remote hearings meets due process, but just barely. And he was right. I mean, he may not be right. I actually don't think it meets the due process concerns, but if it does, it just barely meets it. And then in terms of the importance of lawyers within the process, you know that all immigration judges must be lawyers, but this is not a requirement for asylum officers. But in a really interesting study by Georgetown professors Andy Schoenholtz and Phil Schrag and Dickinson professor Jaya Ramji, it's a study entitled Lives in the Balance, Asylum Adjudications by the Department of Homeland Security. They found that asylum officers held significant biases based on their ethnicity, based on their personal family situation. Like people with kids were more likely to grant cases with kids than people without kids, significantly so, based on their level of experience. But they found that among those asylum officers who had JD degrees, that bias entirely disappeared. It was not notable. Most developed countries provide asylum applicants with access to legal counsel at no cost to the applicant. The United States does not. And that prevents justice from being done. It prevents refugees from having their rights protected. And it's my hope that before I retire, that changes. Brendan F. Brown said that the keeping of world peace has always been the responsibility of lawyers, the designers of international law, and of those juridical institutions which afford the means by which that law may be translated into action. May American lawyers ever seek to extend the blessings of the American system to the whole world. Well, I hope that doesn't happen. But I do hope that American lawyers start playing a role in making the American asylum system a light unto the nations and an example for others, and one which really lives the Refugee Convention and the ideals in it. Dean Brown wrote that in 1945, just after World War II. It really is time that once again America reclaim its place as a light unto the nation when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. And we can't do that without lawyers. I hope at least some of you will help us do that. Thank you. Happy to take any questions you may have. Yeah.
I think one of the more frustrating experiences is watching the bias that can come through the media, watching the bias that can come through the news, and watching the bias that can come through on social media regarding immigration, and engaging either friends or acquaintances who really buy into the negative rhetoric, and then trying to explain, not as eloquently as you do, but trying to explain to them that there is a duty, whether you subscribe to the Torah or the Bible or just a humanistic sense of responsibility to people in the world, trying to explain that to them. What recommendation or what kind of advice would you give to us young law students to maybe turn that discussion into a constitutional discussion or into a legal discussion?
Yeah, this is something we have all been struggling with. Because we have, the facts are on our side, which you would think helps, but it really hasn't. One thing for sure, one thing that we always reiterate, this isn't a legal issue, this is just a factual one, which is that in the history of the refugee program, since President Carter signed the Refugee Act in 1980, not a single resettled refugee has committed a lethal act of terror in this country. Not a single one. And there have been about 3 million people resettled through this program. So they are building an entire system to hedge against a risk that has never manifested itself. I mean, could it? Will it? It could. But it's like of all the risks to guard yourself against and to invest millions and millions of dollars in and sacrifice many, many lives, it's not, there's no basis in fact for it. None whatsoever, but that doesn't seem to matter. And one of the issues that really frustrates me is I often say the Obama administration destroyed the refugee program in order to save it. I mean, they really created extreme vetting, which almost broke the system down in 2011. There's no recourse if you're vetted out. You're not told why you're vetted out. There's a lot of innocent people that may have dialed a bad phone number at one point in their life, and that is held against them. It's a very strange, secretive black box of a system. But the Obama administration did it with the best of intentions. They did it to protect the program because they knew that if a single terrorist got through, it would endanger the entire refugee program. But it didn't work because what happened was the political opposition that wanted to exploit fear just allowed it to just decided, okay, well, the Obama administration put the goalpost here, so we're now going to move the goalpost over here in terms of security vetting. And now it's been moved to a point of impossibility. So there's just no basis in fact for this. We of course make the moral arguments all the time, and that's what really surprises me is that those fall on deaf ears. In the Jewish community, I would say 70% of the Jewish community are with us on this, but in the evangelical community, it's been quite surprising to me that it's much more mixed than that. And that's a community that we really need to spend more, I think, time and energy reaching out to. And it is also frustrating that when I was growing up, of course, there were 3 networks and everybody got their news from either Walter Cronkite or Harry Reasoner or David Brinkley. And now people decide to get their news from whoever's points of view lines up with their own. And Fox News is obsessed with this issue and not with the facts of it. I once made the mistake of deciding that the only way to reach out to the people that are being misinformed is to go on Tucker Carlson. And I regret that decision. And if you wonder why, just Google me, and my interview with Tucker will come up. Any other questions? Yeah.
Kind of going from that, I get asked a lot on how, people who aren't lawyers, who aren't, law students can advocate for immigrants, even though they are not necessarily in a legal position to do so. So I don't know if you have any tips for how best to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves. Yeah,
that's a good point. There's a number of ways that it can be done, and we really need to try to institutionalize them. For example, if you are an asylum seeker who crosses the border and you're placed in expedited removal proceedings, or that can happen when you cross the border without inspection, or it can happen at an airport. If you claim asylum at an airport or enter with a fake document in order to claim asylum and you're put into those proceedings, you have to go to a credible fear hearing, and you can actually be accompanied to a credible fear hearing with a non-attorney. And that can be very, very helpful in terms of both kind of calming the asylum seeker down, but also in terms of being able to document the process. The problem is that by definition, the asylum seekers are in detention until they have that hearing, so getting access to them is difficult. The CARE Coalition here in the DC area had a program for many years where they did facilitate that. I think it's still going on, but it's become, I think, a challenge to administer, but that's one way. Advocacy on, with members of Congress is extremely important in terms of prioritizing this issue and in terms of preparing ourselves for a moment in time when we actually can make a real difference. Even if people live in districts where their Congress people are favorably disposed, or maybe even especially in such districts, it's really important to try to get them to advocate and to prioritize this as an issue. Asylum seekers need services just as badly as some refugees do, but they don't get any. Or they don't get any services until they actually get asylum. And so there are increasing opportunities to volunteer and to help asylum seekers in that situation. And then, of course, if you speak another language, I know at HIAS and at other organizations, volunteer interpreters are really highly valued as well. So there are a number of ways to help. Yeah.
Building on that, are there ways, I know, the asylum process is very complicated, but for current attorneys, I know you said that the airport lawyers that showed up made the biggest difference. Is there a way that, say, somebody like a family lawyer in Maryland could get involved without having to worry about making a mistake along the way that jeopardizes somebody's asylum claim? Is there like a clinic or a way to get involved for current attorneys to participate and help increase that representation number that you mentioned?
Yeah, and family lawyers is an interesting example because they're needed in terms of representing children and their issues, unaccompanied children. So that's a good use for family lawyers, but certainly programs like Human Rights First, they do mentor attorneys who want to represent asylum seekers. As HIAS is building a program right now as well, so there are a number of opportunities to do that, but it does require mentoring. That's one thing I think a lot of organizations underestimate the amount of mentoring that attorneys need the first time or second time that they take on an asylum case. But then after that, the mentee becomes the mentor, and it creates a good system. Yeah.
I'm with No Friends of Refugees in One Journey, and we get requests from refugee families, sometimes asylum seekers, for pro bono lawyers, and we don't often know the groups that may be able to provide them. I know HIAS can, and I'm in Northern Virginia, but who are some of the groups that we could refer them to?
Well, certainly the HIAS, the International Rescue Committee, Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service, LIRS, all the CARE Coalition, Tahare, so the Tahare, which is in Falls Church and in Baltimore. There's quite a few. Yes?
Do you have thoughts on what is the best way to address and prioritize the multitude of due process issues and concerns going on right now in immigration court? I mean, you describe our students who are in Arlington Immigration Court through the clinic are seeing all the problems you talked about, representing clients on video, having to make those decisions, having very difficult access to documents, no discovery, and real language access problems. I mean, we're seeing entire hearings basically that are not interpreted when the attorneys are speaking.
Yeah.
So we want to try to have an impact, but given the constraints on the current administration, I don't know what your thoughts are on the approaches or whether it's an effort that's we're undertaking right now.
Well, that reminds me too of one other good volunteer opportunity for attorneys and non-attorneys, which is being witness in immigration court, right? When there are
Our students did that
Right.
with CARE. They
That
did
is
the CARE
outstanding.
Coalition at a court observation project that our students participated in.
Yeah, that is really important. It really, even though judges are immigration judges have a recording running. It still makes a big difference to have actual people in the courtroom that are watching the proceeding. And in fact, I remember when I was watching a proceeding once, it was a remote proceeding, but I was in the trailer with the detainee, and the judge granted relief in this case. And when we left, the guard said to the detainee, to the asylum seeker, "Wow, that never happens. Today was your lucky day." And I just think it may have been that they were cognizant that we were in the room watching them. But in terms of this really needs to be a priority, is the due process concerns. I mean, especially lack of access to representation, lack of access to the materials you need to represent yourself. I mean, these people are in administrative detention, but they are treated like criminals in terms of their lack of access to internet or other resources. There's no difference between the way they're treated and the way criminals are treated. And then, of course, the remote hearings thing, I think, is a total travesty. And the backlogs in and by themselves and the wait time is a travesty as well. So there's so many due process challenges that are waiting to happen and that, to my knowledge, have not really been pursued yet. But I think we need to spend some time and resources figuring out how to pursue them. Yeah.
I guess kind of touching on that same note, and you mentioned earlier, you talked about Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, I believe was the other country you mentioned. But my question is, which countries around the world from a more global perspective are doing the best job and have the most progressive, I guess, policies right now that maybe the United States people can look towards as being that perfect example of what we should all be trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'm one of the executive director of Refugees International, Eric Schwartz, is on my board. And he also used to be the assistant secretary for the State Department's Refugee Bureau. And so they have a big gala every year, and they like to honor a country that is a role model in terms of the way it treats refugees. And he said the problem is there's only 2 countries left. So they have to keep rotating the chairmanship of this gala between Costa Rica and Portugal. So that's the list. Because, I mean, the real problem is that when a country like Germany and Sweden take leadership and nobody else does, then it does create a rush and pressures on the countries that take positive leadership. In other words, sure, all refugees wanted to go to Germany because they sure didn't want to go to Poland or France or Spain, or Italy, the way that refugees were being treated in those places, so they all went to Germany, and then there was a huge backlash as a result of that. And now I'm afraid, we work in Costa Rica and Panama, and I'm really afraid that there's going to be a backlash in Costa Rica because, yes, they allow asylum seekers to work and they give them rights and they give them access to education. But I'm afraid that could disappear relatively quickly as pressures mount. And right now in South America, you have the largest crisis outside of Syria, displacement crisis in Venezuela. And they're fleeing all over the continent and creating huge backlashes. So right now the list is Portugal and Costa Rica, and I'm afraid it may be half that size in a month or so. Yeah.
It seems from what we've all witnessed and what you've said that there is a global backlash against migration and immigration and refugees. I know that here in the DC area, the One Journey Festival is working really hard to change the narrative about refugees here domestically. How do we do that internationally? I mean, how do we make a difference in terms of the rhetoric being used, the acceptance of people around the world? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to get any better anytime soon. So in your opinion, what's the breaking point, and what can we do not only here domestically, but also around the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I think the best thing we can do is apply pressure here domestically, because the U.S. traditionally, the U.S. has long been very imperfect in this regard, but at least the image that it projected was of a country that welcomed refugees. And I always like to tell a story of Madeleine Albright. I don't know if you've seen Alexandra Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, a few years ago, made an excellent documentary about naturalization. I think it's called Citizenship America, and it's a documentary about where she went to all 50 states to film naturalization ceremonies. And she also interviewed celebrities, including Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine Albright was twice a refugee, once as a child in England from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, and then once here in the United States from the communist Czechoslovakia. And she said the first time she and her family were refugees, everybody in England was very, very nice to her and to her family, but they always asked, when are you going home? And in the United States, they were also very nice, but they always asked, when are you becoming a citizen? And that's really kind of the image that we projected, is that we're a country that allowed refugees to become as American as everybody else. And that was such an important message. And even though that's still technically the process and the possibility under the law, that's not the image that we're projecting across the world now. So the best thing we can do is get our own house in order, and also take advantage of social media and trying to organize some cross-border movements, because there are movements to protect refugees in every country, but they're being drowned out by these voices that are really exploiting fear, because it's really it's not all bad people who are behind these anti-refugee movements, but it's really people who are scared and who are believing the fear-mongering words that are being hurled at them. And I would say, too, I have to give Canada a shout-out, too. I mean, Canada's still is still, they're not as good as they were a few years ago, they're not trending in the right direction, but Canada has also been relatively welcoming to refugees. They welcomed over 25,000 Syrians in 2016, which is, remember, that's a country 1/10 the size of the United States in terms of population. And I think HIAS is trying to collaborate more with our neighbors in the Great White North as well, going to your question. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's not a legal question, but how has HIAS and the other resettlement agencies been affected by the cuts in admission levels?
Yeah, it's been very hard. And it's really one of the frustrations right now is that there are no conversations with the government about how to do resettlement better, how to do a better job of integrating refugees or welcoming them. It's a system that is really a very kind of inexpensive system and I think could be improved in many, many ways, but that conversation isn't happening at all. Everybody is in survival mode because the administration, I think, is really making a concerted effort to dismantle the capacity of this country to resettle refugees. And case in point, last year, every year we go through this ritual. There have been 9 resettlement agencies since President Carter signed the Refugee Act of 1980. Some of them have changed, but that has been the number since 1980, and there have been the same agencies for at least 25 years now. And so last year, in the annual ritual of the State Department issuing their request for proposals, for the first time they said the State Department intends to reduce the number of partner agencies in the refugee program from the current 9. And so the reason why that system was created in the first place is because the 9 agencies all bring different constituencies, because it is a public-private partnership. So we bring the Jews, the Catholic Conference brings the Catholics, World Relief brings the evangelicals, etc. But they told us they were basically going to cut entire communities out of the program. And then time went by, and they never got around to making that decision. And so now we're about to undergo it again, and once again we're expecting that whole agencies will be cut. We don't know which ones, we don't know what the criteria is going to be, but that would be devastating in terms of actually reducing capacity of communities to resettle refugees. And there was a time a few years ago when all these new communities wanted to come in, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is now a very strong partner of all 9 agencies. Islamic Relief USA wanted to come in and resettle refugees, but now we're, of course, in a mode where we're actually under threat from our supposed partner, the United States government. And we've had to close sites all over the country. I mean, HIAS has had to we haven't closed our agencies because our model of partnership, like the Catholic model, is we partner with social service agencies that deliver a lot of services, so they're not entirely dependent on refugees. for the most part, but we've closed our refugee program in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Boston, in Toledo, in Wilmington, Delaware. And this year, the State Department told the agencies that we had to make decisions or make recommendations collectively to close 35 sites around the country. So we did that as a group exercise, which was not fun, in December of this year. And the worst thing is trying to retain staff, because they obviously don't feel valued by our federal partner. And their jobs are not secure because they realize that they don't get paid very much to begin with. This is truly a labor of love for them. And they're under the gun, and they could lose their jobs any minute, and refugees are not arriving. Last year, in 2018, the ceiling was 45,000, which was the lowest ceiling since the passage of the Refugee Act, and we only managed to bring in 22,491, so not even half that number. So even the low ceilings that are being set by the administration are not being met. And the refugee agencies, the local sites are reimbursed not on their costs, but based on the number of refugees that actually arrive, which is something that they have no control over. So they're told, you have to plan for 100 refugees, you have to staff for 100 refugees and get office space to accommodate 100 refugees, but then if only 50 arrive, you'll only get funded for 50. So it's a system that is not, it can't keep going on like this. We're in really a difficult shape, but we can't make it about us. We're just trying to make it about the capacity to resettle refugees and to stay around so that once again, we're going to be in a position to do that. But there was a year in 1980, this country welcomed 220,000 refugees. It's just incredible. And now we can't even get to half of 45,000. So on that happy note.
Oh, thank you. Well, let me take this opportunity to thank you for such an inspiring and interesting talk, and also for making time in your busy schedule to speak with us today. On behalf of the entire law school community, I would like to thank everyone who made this talk today possible, and I would like to present this small token of our appreciation to you for in recognition of this day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.